The question is not whether it is worth eating human meat, but what kind of meat you should eat. Let's discuss today a very sensitive issue of our existence. The very question, because of which we may not be told the true history of mankind. We will talk about the meat diet of our ancestors, and those distant Neanderthals and Cro-Magnates, about whom historians know nothing. Let's talk about people who lived in a much closer time period for us, the 14th-19th century. It's no secret that there are practically no cemeteries in the world founded before the 18th century. Cities, according to the historical version, grew intensively in size. The number of inhabitants continuously increased. But here's the weird thing. Archaeologists find quite a few ancient cemeteries. It's like we have two big periods. This is the period of the Sarmatian Scythians, in which people were kept in mounds. It is not known when this period began, but it most likely ended in the 14th century. So, until the 14th century, people with elongated and ordinary skulls were buried in mounds. Then comes the period of the Middle Ages, and the tradition of keeping people in cemeteries and burial mounds for some reason disappears somewhere. Massive accumulations of bones are certainly found on the territory of Europe, but they are usually found during construction work. And these places have never been marked as a cemetery anywhere before. There are also seemingly refined funeral grounds in Europe. But these collections of bones are very difficult to call cemeteries. This can be called a warehouse of well-boiled and cleaned bones. Here, for example, is the Chapel of Bones in Aveiro, Portugal. It can be said to be decorated with the bones of more than 5,000 people. According to the historical version, there is nothing unusual in this story. In the 16th century, there were 43 cemeteries in Aveiro that occupied valuable land, and therefore, in order for these lands to make a profit, the monks dug up all the bones from the cemeteries and decorated the church with these bones. The usual history of the Middle Ages. There are quite a lot of such churches in Europe, and the largest collection of bones is the Paris catacombs. The remains of several million people are stored there. There's nothing unusual about it. People collected bones in the catacombs, so it was just more convenient for them. The land is expensive, so why spend it on a cemetery? In this story, only one thing surprises, namely the appearance of the bones themselves. There is a feeling that these bones, if not boiled, have passed the stage of very thorough cleaning. Now fast forward to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and consider other and quite unusual structures. The so-called public toilets of ancient Rome. As you understand, there was no ancient Rome, but such buildings have been preserved, which historians have dubbed public toilets. Moreover, these structures are found not only in large cities, they are found even in settlements consisting of two streets. So according to historians, the mythical ancient Romans loved to spend time in public restrooms. Such toilets were used by representatives of the middle class. After all, historians know that the entrance to the public toilet was paid, and poor people simply did not have the means to take advantage of the benefits of civilization. And there was something to pay for. First of all, the Romans conducted small talk in these rooms. We read poetry, discussed the latest political news, made business appointments. Clean running water ran along the grooves built into the floor. Since toilet paper had not yet been invented, the Romans wiped themselves with reusable sea sponges fixed on sticks, which after use were washed in running water in a duct under their feet. That's why the shape of the glasses is so strange. The hole is not only on top, but also between the legs. This is done just so that a person can remove excess without getting up with the help of a sponge on a stick. Since it was quite uncomfortable to sit on a stone, there were specially trained slaves who warmed the marble benches with their fifth point while waiting for customers. Judging by the descriptions of historians, it was just some kind of communal paradise, a club of true gentlemen, who were happy to discuss political and city news in such places, and even read new poems. Everything here was for the convenience of wealthy patriots. And reusable sponges, and special slaves for warming up the seats, and even pleasantly bubbling water under your feet. Just an idyllic picture. The truth confuses me a few tiny moments. First of all, how do historians know about the real purpose of these premises? After all, the first toilet room was discovered by the Italian archaeologist Giacomo Boni only in 1913. In his report, he suggested that the leaky bench could be part of a complex mechanism designed to supply water to the upper rooms of the palace. And this is a very important fact. This means that, until 1913th year, no one knew anything about the purpose of such premises. But today historians tell about these places in great detail. Paid entrance, intimate conversations of patricians on a point, how to use a reusable sponge. I wonder how historians know all this. The second interesting point is the material from which the toilet benches are made. According to historians, people sat on the stone for hours discussing political news. Everything seems to be fine. In summer, it is hot in Rome and other cities of the Mediterranean Sea, and it is very comfortable to sit on a pebble in the shade. But after all, in Rome, not only is the summer hot, there is also a fairly cool winter, when the temperature can drop to 3 degrees. Now imagine the patricians come to the public toilet in winter, sit down on a cooled marble bench, and start a leisurely conversation about politics and sports. If a man after 40 sits at least a few times on cold pebbles, then he inevitably has a rather painful inflammation called prostatitis. So there is nothing surprising in the fact that ancient Rome has disappeared. Ancient Rome was ruined by public toilets, prostatitis, and reusable sponges. Of course, one can object here, because historians have told about specially trained slaves who heated a marble point while waiting for a client. So that's it. Only here, I can't imagine how a person with his fifth point can warm up a marble slab weighing several hundred kilograms. The third interesting point is that public restrooms were located not only in big cities, but also in small towns for several hundred people. If in big cities, it was an interest club that quite a lot of people came to, then who went to such places in villages where slaves and hired workers lived mainly, and the middle class was represented by 12 people who had their own villas with all amenities. And that's what I'm getting at. Historians do not know exactly the purpose of these premises. They don't know who built it when and why. I found an interesting version here from this blogger. Link in the description. In his opinion, these places were used as slaughterhouses. The man was put on his knees and lowered his head into the hole. The head was cut off, and the blood flowed down special grooves in the floor. Sponges on sticks collected the remnants of blood from the floor. The version is of course controversial, but you will read it yourself. There are very specific pictures presented there. This fresco also agrees with this version. According to historians, the Roman goddess Fortuna protected toilet visitors from danger. But I am confused by the big sword and the strange cup in her hands. These things hint at something else. Now let's go back to the Middle Ages and see how society as a whole treated human remains. This question is well discussed in the book Nablo, Medicinal Cannibalism in English Literature and Culture of Modern Times. And also, in a book by Richard Saga, from Durham University of England, called Mummies, Cannibals and Vampires. The History of Cadaveric Medicine from the Renaissance to the Victorian Era. In these books it is told that for several hundred years, it reached its peak in the 16th-17th centuries. Many Europeans, including members of the royal family, priests and scientists, have taken medications containing human bones, blood and fat, as a cure for everything from headaches to epilepsy. Mummies for medicines were taken from Egyptian tombs, skulls from Irish burials. Egyptian mummies were finely ground and added to tinctures for internal bleeding. Thomas Willis, a pioneer of brain science in the 17th century, mixed powdered human skull and chocolate, and thus obtained medicines for apoplexy and bleeding. King Charles II of England sipped royal drops his personal tincture containing a human skull and alcohol. Moss powder, which sprouted on human skulls, was considered very valuable. He was believed to be treating nosebleeds and possibly epilepsy. Skulls overgrown with moss were imported en masse to England from Ireland. And there were good reasons for that. Firstly, the British were embarrassed to use the skulls of their compatriots. Secondly, moss begins to germinate on the skull under certain conditions. More often this happens when the body has not been buried. Secondly, a person must be put to death by violent death. And Ireland in the 17th century was a country littered with piles of dead bodies. One summer, the father of chemistry, Robert Boyle, suffered badly from a nosebleed. During a particularly tough case, Boyle decided to use the skull moss, which was sent to his sister by a great man, as a gift from Ireland. The usual method was to inject moss, often in powder, directly into the nostrils. But Boyle found that he could stop the bleeding completely, just by holding moss in his hand. In 1694 year, Pierre Pommet, the chief apothecary of Louis XIV, commented on how English apothecaries, especially London ones, sell the heads or skulls of the dead, on which there is a small greenish moss. England received such skulls from Ireland. He also remembers describing the English export of home-covered skulls to foreign countries, especially to Germany, where they were used as an ointment for wounds, as well as to stop bleeding. The litter tells English pharmacists usually bring these heads from Ireland. This country has been wonderful for them since the Irish massacre. Moss-covered skulls were of high value. In the time of Charles II, one skull could cost 11 shillings. During the reign of George I, skulls became the subject of international export. They were even specially designated in the list of customs duties of 1725th year. The duty on one skull was 1 shilling. Human fat was used as an external ointment. Rubbing fat into the skin was considered an effective remedy for gout. The German-Swiss doctor Paracelsus believed that human blood is useful for drinking. Poor people who could not buy processed blood in pharmacies came to public executions and collected the victim's blood with handkerchiefs. Also in German countries, the executioner was considered a great healer, and it was possible to buy a cup of blood from him for a small amount. Powders for mummies were sold in German pharmacies until the beginning of the 20th century. In 1908, the last known attempt to swallow blood on the scaffold was made in Germany. As you can see, until the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was very loyal to the use of medicines prepared from humans. There doesn't seem to be anything unusual about this. Even today, some medicines are made from the same ingredients. So it is, but the medicine is only the top of the pyramid. Look at this engraving. Here, Europeans exchange meat for native ornaments. What kind of meat? I think it is not necessary to explain. And what is important to emphasize is that a European acts as a seller in the shop. This is just a piece of the engraving. The entire engraving can be viewed at the link in the description. It has all the details. So the people of the Middle Ages treated the human body very freely. They could use it as a basis for the preparation of medicines. They also didn't hesitate to use it as meat. Now we'll take a little break from the gloomy stories and look at such a beautiful thing as English bone china. This is an elegant product, and the word bone in the name does not mean more durable or any other. Its simple bone china is a mixture of bone ash with ceramic material. Bone ash gives the porcelain a warm, soft color and transparency. The composition of the product can include up to 45% of bone ash. They say that they used cow bones. Well, here's the strange thing, as I've told you before, many churches in England are very similar to crematoriums. We don't have cemeteries of the Middle Ages, but there are buildings similar to crematoriums. So, very often churches are built according to a very simple scheme. There is an altar part, a refectory adjoins it, and already a bell tower, with something similar to a trumpet, adjoins the refectory. I have always been confused by the name of such a large room as the refectory. From the refectory immediately exit the bell tower similar to the oven. So what if the bodies were burned in a furnace? But bones are very difficult to burn without a trace, and therefore, there is not enough fourth room for recycling in this scheme. And which place still enjoys a bad reputation in the villages? That's right, the mill. It is the mill in fairy tales that is often associated with evil spirits. Although this is illogical, the mill, on the contrary, should symbolize a holiday, harvest, and satiety. But no, it's often said about the mill that it's a damn place. And here's what's interesting. In the UK, at the beginning of the 19th century, a specialized bone mill operated, located in the town of Narborough. And there was more than one such mill. In 1820, almost every port on the east coast had access to one or more crushing mills. At the mill in Narborough, bones were processed into finely ground bone meal, which was applied to the fields as fertilizer. As they say, whalebone was mainly processed. Well, read on. The villagers brought some bones to grind. Bones also came from northern Germany. Ships brought back bones taken from the graves. No one bothered with ethics, but just said 1 ton of German bone dust saves the import of 10 tons of German corn. I wonder what was going on in Germany in 1820th year. Wasn't there a state there? Why was there a huge flow of human bones coming from these territories? Let's move on to the last part of our story. Let's call it subterranean mystical. Since childhood, we have all heard about underground passages that are usually located under church buildings. It always surprised me. Why is there an underground passage under the church? There are underground passages all over the world. In America, they say that they were built by Chinese smugglers. In Russia, merchants are used to move goods. There are a lot of moves found, but almost no one studies them. Or rather, almost no one. Enthusiasts from the Stolen History Forum analyzed 228 stories about the tunnels of East Anglia. So 122 tunnels end in church places such as the abbey, cathedral, chapel, church, monastery. A lot of tunnels connect seemingly contradictory places. The tavern and pub are connected to a convent or a church. The churches also had underground passages to meet markets. And that's what's weird. These tunnels were almost always found by accident. There is no mention of their construction either in the city or in the church archives. It's as if the tunnels were built by some people, and the houses and churches above the tunnels are completely different. It's like in the novel The Time Machine by Herbert Wells. Happy people live on the surface, going about their business, enjoying the sun. But right under the feet of these happy people is hidden another creepy world of brick tunnels in which the Morlocks live. Morlocks rise at night from their brick tunnels and eat happy illa. It seems to be all the fantasies of mad science fiction writers, but in Europe the cult of fairy tales about the eaters of small children is very common. There is even a monument to one devourer in Bern. All these stories seem to hint to us about a certain force that uses people for food. But this is all mysticism. Let's move on to interesting facts. There are events in the political history of England that are connected with the attacks of peasants on churches, and more interestingly, on meat markets. In England, skewers for long pigs are often found in kitchens. English nouns for various religious structures are surprisingly similar to English nouns associated with the meat trade and meat processing. There were many pubs in England called the Merry Monk. In many underground tunnels in England, meat hooks hang from the walls. Special cups for human fat have been preserved. Also surprising are the huge rooms located under the toilet rooms of the convent. Vaulted rooms 3 meters high, were found under the toilet of the monastery of St. Michael in Stamford, where 40 nuns live. The convents of England are some kind of strange mystical story. The abbot's name is Father, the nuns are sisters. These monasteries were often connected by tunnels with taverns and meat markets. Monasteries often threw babies up for upbringing. They brought them up, but for some reason, they still find mass graves of children and infants on the site of monasteries and orphanages for orphans. In Ireland, at the site of the excavation of the former mother and child home in Tuam, County Galway, an underground structure was discovered divided into 20 chambers, containing a significant number of human remains totaling 800 people aged from 35 weeks to 3 years. This orphanage was run by the Catholic Order of Monks. Also in Lincoln, England, churchmen until 1535th year gathered chickens, babies and young children for the treatment of diseases such as leprosy. All this speaks of some strange connection of English churches and monasteries with meat markets, taverns and hospitals for the treatment of lepers. Humanity in the 14th century, even according to official history, experienced a network of catastrophic events that resulted in the Great Famine of 1315 year. So after this famine, a huge number of Catholic churches with refectories appeared. There were women's monasteries, where young children were brought up. And by a strange coincidence, the churches and monasteries of England were very often connected with meat markets by underground passages. Of course, this may be just a coincidence, but by a strange coincidence, at the beginning of the 19th century, when the world economy recovered and the food problem was solved in almost all countries. In England, a lot of small workers, that is teenagers, appeared at all enterprises. Teenagers worked in all spheres, from cadet factories to coal mines. At the end of the 19th century, in the USA, there was such a thing as orphan trains. Teenagers were transported by trains all over the American continent and given to everyone. And it wasn't an adoption. Teenagers were transported as free labor. And here is the conclusion that can be drawn from this. The system that used children as a product outlived itself in the 18th century. But there were a lot of children in the monasteries, and in order to use them somehow, they began to be given to production. This is of course a very controversial theory, but all the facts say that the history of the Middle Ages does not look as beautiful as romantic engravings draw us. There was hunger, eating their own kind, the production of medicines, parchment from human bodies, and even the great campaigns of thousands of armies are no longer surprising. After all, the main question is what the army eats on a campaign that lasts for years. That's what it feeds on. The history of mankind of the Middle Ages can be well conveyed by this symbol. That's it. Watch my channel.